The brand new Tesla Model Y has just officially been announced, and after years of leaks and renders and guesswork, we can finally see what it is going to look like in all of its glory, as well as what the specs are meant to be. And so it's meant to be shipping in its longest range form in a 551-kilometer range on the WLTP cycle. Now, of course, this is going to be for the Australian version that is currently being displayed for sale on the Australian website. And so that did get me guessing or wondering what else could you kind of derive to see what its true specs across the full range could be. As we know, it's apparently redesigned from end to end, but what can that truly get? As it seems that all of the countries that are being fed from the Gigafactory in Shanghai have just made this announcement, as the US version of the Tesla website still showcases the old school Model Y, leading people to believe that there will be a phased rollout where Giga Shanghai will have it first, and then they will go to Fremont and Berlin and onwards from there, as that is what services the entire world. But it seems that the Chinese variant will be coming first. However, when I then looked into this, I found it very interesting that the Australian version only gives you the one version of wheel, being the 20-inch Helix 2.0 wheels. You do not get any option to reduce it down from a 20 to maybe try and maximize range further. However, as we can see on the Chinese version, it is not the same wheel, and furthermore, we do also get the option to then upgrade, so to say, to the 20-inch wheel that would be representative of the Australian version. And so I then wanted to know what kind of range differences are we implying, or are Tesla implying, from these wheels and the different variations from across the world. Where it does start to become a little bit more tricky, though, is actually then reverse engineering how far things are meant to go if we had the smaller wheels, and going all the way down to the USA even, EPA cycle, which seems to be the closest of the more generic cycles between the Chinese cycle that is quite hopeful in what it projects out of the total range, whereas the WLTP cycle is slightly more reined in, but then the EPA seems to be the most accurate. In some cases, modern Teslas have, however, been exceeding that number. Now, luckily for me, Tesla's website across all international variants seems to be close enough where I don't have to be speaking every language under the sun to be understanding what I am looking at, as we can piece it together between the 201 being this top speed, the 5.9 being the 0 to 100 km/h time, and then the 559 being the estimated range on the CLTC cycle. So to start off, I wanted to know the difference between the CLTC cycle estimates and the WLTP cycle estimates, being 559 compared to 446 for apparently the same car, also both in the launch series. If that makes a difference long term, we shall see. But it ended up coming out to about a 1.2 deficit, being 559 kilometers is 1.2 times greater, or 20% larger than 466 kilometers. I then checked this against the other variant, being the long-range all-wheel drive variant at 662 compared to 551, and once again, within rounding errors, it comes out to 1.2, so it was a nice bang-on number of 20% longer. Where it then gets very nicely interesting, though, is if you do come down on the Chinese side, you can then obviously, like I said, change to the 19-inch wheels. And then all of a sudden, we do gain even more range, up to 719 on the all-wheel drive long-range variant and 593 kilometers on the rear-wheel drive variant. And so by establishing that the Chinese cycle was estimating to be 20% longer than the WLTP cycle, I could take the 719 kilometers and divide it by 120% to get basically on 600 kilometers. So we're then seeing a 50-kilometer range difference between the long-range all-wheel drive on the 19 and the 20-inch wheels, both of which are very respectable numbers in their own right and quite competitive within the segment, but at the same time, especially for a country like Australia, which is culturally honed in on the fact that electric vehicles don't have the range, especially in a country that is so sparsely populated, both infrastructure and with population of people, I'm surprised, and it would be nice to see them just give us the 10% possible range increase by possibly optioning the 19-inch wheels over the 20-inch wheels. Especially as on the Chinese side, to go from the 19th to the 20-inch wheels actually costs more. So if you could even reduce the price of the Model Y in Australia more with the 19-inch wheels, that would be a lovely addition to see. However, I wasn't particularly satisfied with that yet to try and drill down to see how far these new Juniper Model Ys will truly go on a cycle. And as much as no range estimation is ever going to be bang on to be able to provide an individual circumstances, whether it be temperature, mountain regions, whatever it may be, speed of driving in Western countries versus other countries, there are so many factors that go into it, but it seems like for a lot of people living in Western countries, the EPA range seems to be more closely accurate to long-range driving, which is when people are more likely to be worried about the range of the vehicle. And so without being able to take one of these cars on the road and go for a drive, it made me wonder, where can I get enough data to try and piece it together to truly see once and for all, until we can get the tires on the tarmac, how far will it go? And so for that, I turned to the Model 3. In particular, I turned to Out of Spec and their Tesla Model 3 Mega Highway Range Test, which was able to compare all the different variants that they could get their hands on, both old and new, to truly see how far they can go from 0 to 100 to get real world results in their own element. If you haven't seen their videos, they do a great job of just comparing all breadths and models of cars in the most scientifically accurate way they can possibly do, getting 2 cars on one day, and in this day they got all 5. And as I mentioned, they did, for a lot of them, end up beating the EPA mile rating. Whereas on the left side of the screen here, I have the Australian version of the Model 3. Now, that isn't exactly what they have on the right side, but for all intents and purposes, it can be the same car. If I got the long-range all-wheel drive, it can be the same as this white long-range all-wheel drive with the Panasonic battery, getting an EPA range of 341 miles, but a real-world range of 70 miles an hour on the highway at 365 miles. Turning now back to the left side of the screen though, and we can see that the long-range all-wheel drive Model 3 in white, if it made a difference, gets 629 kilometers in the WLTP cycle. Now, of course, this isn't the number that it ended up doing. It actually ended up doing 365 miles, being 587 kilometers, closer to the WLTP, but really still within 50 kilometers less, the same amount roughly as the 19 versus 20-inch wheel difference. So then with all of this data, we start to truly be able to reverse engineer how far this new Model Y can actually go in a long-range trip, even without having the treatment that the Model 3 did with the long-range rear-wheel drive, as currently from everything that's being shown, it is only being the long-range all-wheel drive. And in their test, the rear-wheel drive only did manage to accomplish 23 more miles, which is a decent bit further again. So by taking the 365 miles that the Model 3 in the Out of Spec video accomplished, you get 587 kilometers, which is 7% less than the claimed in the WLTP cycle of 629. Then you can move back over to the WLTP cycle of the new Model Y. Of course, this is once again with the Australian variant being in the 20-inch wheels, apparently claiming 551. Now, by taking the 551 kilometer range estimate and timesing it by 93%, once again the 7% differential, you get 512.5 kilometers, which seemingly is going to be more realistic and within the realm of tolerance for what people would expect a car to be able to do, both within the cycle being long range and short range. That is an EPA range tested cycle. But then, of course, to come full circle back around, that number of 512 and 551 is not inclusive of the possibility that apparently, as we can see on the Chinese site, the 19-inch versus the 20-inch wheels changes it by a decent margin. And so by then taking the 600 kilometers that we originally claimed and calculated, that number would then go back up over the WLTP cycle of the 20-inch rims, back up to 558 kilometers. Now, of course, this has just been a bombardment of numbers, and there's rounding errors and translation differences between miles, kilometers, even cycle to cycle there is going to be differences, temperature, like I said, driving styles, so many different things can implement and change and impact the last and final number that if you were behind the wheel, you would experience. But overall, it does seem like the new Model Y is very capable of doing some very large numbers, which people have been asking for a very long time, especially being the world's best-selling car so many times. However, it does seem like a very strange move that the same cars coming out of the same factory even though they are having different right versus left-hand drive models and paint colors, that the Model Y would not be offered for a country like Australia, like I said, a sparsely populated, infrastructure currently lacking country, to not be offered the option to have a range extending, so to say, 19-inch wheel variant. And so with that, it would be interesting to see once the USA site updates itself to be inclusive of the new Model Y, we will see what they get offered as well, because these are coming from different factories. And of course, like I said, you cannot take every little thing into comparison, and until basically out of spec get their hands on one of these, we will not see the true range comparatively to all the other vehicles. But until then, it's a nice little brainstorm, and as like I said, there are so many numbers going on, but it ends up being that the WLTP cycle could be so accurate if we are given the smaller rims. And that seems like a very wasted potential for an otherwise seemingly going to be and very waited for car. And so Tesla, please deliver the goods. We are all waiting for this to continue being the world's best-selling vehicle.